the sky was still black when he grabbed my arm. Commander Grant Holloway, the base commander, a man who'd spent 30 years mistaking volume for authority, hauled me back from the taxiway like I was a stray dog that had wandered onto his runway. "You can't be on this runway," he barked, loud enough that the ground crew 20 yards off turned to look. "This is a restricted operation. Get behind the fence before I have you escorted off this base entirely." I didn't fight him. I didn't raise my voice. I just looked past his shoulder at the C-130 idling on the tarmac, engines already spooled, and I raised my hand, 3 fingers, then a fist, then an open palm turned toward the cockpit. A signal. Nothing dramatic to anyone who didn't know what it meant. But the pilot knew. The plane, already rolling toward the runway threshold, brakes locking hard enough that dust kicked up in the floodlights, began to turn. Holloway's grip on my arm went slack. Over the tower radio, loud enough to bleed out of every speaker on that ramp, a voice said the words that would end his career of assumptions: "Keep the engines running. She's the mission lead." I watched his face do something I'd waited 2 years to see. Not confusion. Recognition, the specific, sickening kind that comes when a man realizes he's spent months building his certainty on top of nothing at all. His hand actually fell off my arm like it had gone numb. Behind him, I could see Lieutenant Casey Marsh, the golden boy of the squadron, the officer Holloway had spent a year parading in front of visiting brass, standing frozen with his mouth slightly open. To understand how it came to this, you have to go back to a change of command ceremony 8 months earlier, in a hangar dressed up with folding chairs and a podium too small for the room. That was the night Holloway first decided, out loud, in front of someone who actually understood what my job was, that I didn't matter. I want to be clear about something before I go further. I never asked anyone to believe me. I stopped doing that a long time before this story even starts. But there's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from being underestimated by someone who has never once bothered to ask what you actually do. And that night, in that hangar, exhausted wasn't a strong enough word for what I felt. The ceremony was for a general, retiring, decorated, the kind of officer people whispered about with real respect. I'd been assigned as an escort for a visiting liaison, a woman from Joint Intelligence I'd worked with exactly once, on a project neither of us was allowed to discuss above a certain classification. Holloway found us near the refreshment table. He didn't know who she was. He just saw me standing next to someone important, and something in him decided that needed correcting. "This is one of my admin staff," he said to her, not even looking at me while he said it. "Keeps the paperwork moving. Not exactly glamorous work, but somebody's got to do it." He laughed like he'd made a joke we were all supposed to enjoy together. The liaison, the one person in that hangar who actually held a clearance high enough to know my real function, went very still. She didn't correct him. She wasn't allowed to. But she looked at me, just for a second, with an expression that said she understood exactly how wrong he was, and that neither of us could say so out loud. That silence sat in my chest like a stone for the rest of the night. Somewhere behind that stone, quietly, I started keeping score. Not out of spite. Out of necessity. Because a man who calls you admin staff in front of the one person who could correct him, and doesn't get corrected, is a man who will keep saying it. And I was right. I should tell you what I actually did, because Holloway never once asked. I worked in military intelligence, signals analysis, threat assessment, the unglamorous architecture underneath operations that make the news for entirely different reasons. My clearance sat 2 tiers above anything Holloway needed to know about, and for good reason. The work wasn't the kind you talked about at hangar parties. It was the kind that got transport planes rerouted, personnel repositioned, missions authorized or scrubbed based on numbers nobody outside a locked room ever saw. None of that mattered to Holloway, because none of it was visible. What was visible was Casey Marsh, Lieutenant Casey Marsh, the pilot Holloway had adopted the way some men adopt golf as a personality. Casey flew clean approaches. Casey looked sharp in dress uniform. Casey had a talent for standing exactly where cameras were pointed during base tours, shaking exactly the right hands. He wasn't a bad officer. He just occupied a category Holloway understood, loud competence, photographed competence, while I occupied one he'd never had to learn to see. Holloway used to joke, in front of the whole operations wing, that Casey was the future of this base while gesturing vaguely at people like me as the folks keeping the lights on. He meant it as inclusion. It landed like erasure. And when I brought concerns up the chain, actual operational concerns, flagged through proper channels, about intelligence protocols being sidestepped for the sake of good optics during Casey's showcase flights, Holloway signed off on every one of Casey's requests anyway, and quietly noted in my file that I was difficult to work with. That phrase followed me for months. Difficult. As if precision were a personality flaw. I want to say I laughed it off, but I didn't, not at first. I went home some nights and sat with the specific, cold anger of being punished for being right. The one person who never needed convincing was my grandfather, Colonel Frank Alden, retired Air Force, a man who'd spent 40 years doing the same invisible work I did and had the quiet, weathered patience of someone who understood exactly what it cost. He used to sit with me on his porch during leave and ask real questions, not how's the army treating you, but what's the threat picture looking like this quarter. Questions that told me he actually knew what I did for a living, and respected it enough to ask specifics. They'll underestimate you for exactly as long as you let your value depend on them noticing it, he told me once, turning a coffee mug slowly in his hands like the words needed weight behind them. The day you stop needing Holloway's approval is the day his opinion of you becomes irrelevant. Let the work speak. Eventually somebody with the right ears will be listening. I held on to that. Not as comfort, as instruction. Somewhere around month 6, I stopped trying to explain my job to anyone who hadn't earned the explanation. I stopped correcting Holloway in meetings. I stopped hoping Casey's next showcase flight would be the one where someone finally asked what I actually contributed to make it possible. I redirected all of that energy into something quieter, and considerably more permanent. The operation that would eventually put me on that runway before dawn had been in motion for weeks before Holloway ever heard its name. I'd been designated mission lead for a classified transport coordination, the kind of assignment that comes through channels several levels above base command, routed to me specifically because of clearance, not rank insignia, not photogenic competence. Holloway wasn't looped in on the details. That wasn't an oversight. That was protocol. But it also meant, when the operations timeline finally intersected with his runway, he had absolutely no framework for understanding why I'd be standing on his tarmac at 4 a.m. giving hand signals to a C-130 pilot. I didn't plan the confrontation. I planned around the possibility of one. I flagged, through official operations channels, that mission lead personnel would require unescorted runway access during the departure window, cited the authorization codes, made sure the tower had the paperwork on file 48 hours in advance. I made sure the pilot, Captain Ana Reyes, had my visual signal briefed and confirmed before wheels-up clearance. I did every part of my job exactly the way I was trained to, quietly, procedurally, without a single word wasted on convincing Holloway of anything. What I didn't account for was Holloway deciding, at 3:40 that morning, to personally walk the ramp for what he called a surprise inspection, which everyone on base understood to really mean an excuse to parade Casey's early departure prep in front of visiting brass scheduled to arrive that week. He saw me near the taxiway markers, unfamiliar to him in that specific context, and made the same decision he'd been making about me for 8 months. He decided I didn't belong there. He never once considered that the paperwork clearing me existed, sitting in a file 2 clearance levels above the one he checked. That decision is what put his hand on my arm. And it's what made the words coming out of that tower radio land the way they did, not just for him, but for every officer standing close enough to hear it. The plane taxied back to the apron, engines still turning, and Captain Reyes climbed down onto the tarmac herself instead of sending a crew member, which told me she understood exactly how much this moment mattered and wanted her authority standing behind mine in person. Holloway hadn't moved. He looked, for the first time since I'd met him, like a man doing frantic arithmetic in his head and not liking any of the numbers. Then the tower called again, patched through to a name that made even Reyes straighten her shoulders, General Okafor, regional oversight for the operation, listening in from a secure line because that's what mission-critical departures required. His voice came through flat, unbothered, entirely uninterested in ceremony. Commander Holloway, step away from my mission lead. She has full runway authority for this departure, effective as of 0400. I'd like an explanation of why that wasn't communicated to your operations desk, and I'd like it after this aircraft is airborne. I have replayed that sentence more times than I'm proud of. Not because I needed it, my grandfather had already taught me not to need it, but because some starving, patient part of me had been waiting 2 years to watch someone with real authority say, out loud, in front of witnesses, what I had always quietly known to be true. Casey Marsh, standing near the hangar door in his flight jacket, hadn't said a word this entire time. When I finally looked at him, his expression wasn't smug or defensive. It was something closer to embarrassment, the look of a man realizing he'd spent a year accepting praise partly built on someone else's invisible labor, and hadn't thought to question it once. Holloway found his voice eventually, thin and formal, the voice of a man trying to salvage rank he no longer felt secure in. Ma'am, I wasn't briefed on your designation. That's an oversight on operations part, not mine. It's on file, I said. Not sharp. Not triumphant. Just factual, the way I'd said everything to him for 8 months and watched him not listen. It's been on file since Tuesday. He didn't argue further. There wasn't anywhere left for the argument to go. General Okafor's voice was still live on the line, and every officer on that ramp knew it. Holloway stepped back from the taxiway markers himself this time, no one pulling him, and for the first time since I'd met him, he looked at me like he was actually trying to see something he'd missed. The plane departed 9 minutes later than scheduled. Reyes gave me a short nod before climbing back into the cockpit, the kind of nod that passes between people who've just watched a wrong get quietly righted and don't need to make a speech about it. I stood on that tarmac and watched the C-130 lift off into a sky just starting to go gray at the edges, and I let myself feel exactly what I'd earned, not vindication, not really. Just the specific, clean relief of no longer having to prove something I already knew. Holloway requested a private meeting with me 2 days later. I went, mostly out of professional obligation. He didn't perform an elaborate apology, to his credit, he wasn't the type, and I wouldn't have believed one anyway. He said, stiffly, that he'd reviewed my file more carefully, that he understood now the scope of what I'd been managing, and that he regretted the comment at the ceremony. He asked, almost as an afterthought, what exactly my role had encompassed this whole time. I told him the truth, in the plain, procedural language I'd have used with anyone who'd earned the explanation 8 months earlier. He listened this time. Really listened, the way people do when they've finally understood the cost of not listening sooner. It wasn't friendship. It wasn't going to be. But it was, for the first time, respect that hadn't required me to perform for it. Casey found me separately, in the mess hall a week later, and said something closer to genuine than I expected, that he hadn't known, that he should have asked, that he'd let himself enjoy being the base's favorite without wondering who was doing the work that made his flights possible in the first place. I told him it wasn't his fault, which was mostly true. He hadn't built the imbalance. He'd just never questioned benefiting from it. I got reassigned 3 months later, off Holloway's base entirely, onto a joint operations team where every person in the room already understood exactly what my clearance meant without needing it explained. Nobody there called me admin staff. Nobody needed a runway confrontation to figure out my worth, because the work spoke for itself the moment I walked in the door, the way my grandfather always said it eventually would. My grandfather passed away that winter, quietly, in his sleep, the way men like him seem to insist on doing even in death, no drama, no announcement, just a life fully lived and then finished. I sat with him near the end, and I told him about the runway, about Okafor's voice on that radio, about Holloway's hand falling off my arm. He smiled and said he wasn't surprised, that he'd known for years the day was coming, he'd just been waiting for me to stop needing it to. Holloway reached out once more, months after I'd transferred, a short message congratulating me on a promotion he'd read about in a briefing. I answered politely, professionally, and nothing more. Some doors don't need slamming shut. They just quietly stop being ones you walk back through. I think about that hangar sometimes, about a man calling me admin staff in front of someone who knew better, about the particular silence that followed. And I think about a pilot, at 4 a.m, choosing to believe a hand signal over a commander's shout, because she'd been briefed by someone who'd earned that trust the long, unglamorous way. Some people spend their whole careers standing where the cameras point. Some of us just make sure the plane knows exactly who to listen to when it matters. If any part of this sounded familiar, if you've ever been the one nobody thought to ask, doing work nobody bothered to notice until it couldn't be ignored anymore, I'd genuinely like to hear your story. Drop it in the comments. I read every one.